Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I'll put on the share right now. And we are working on Torah Temimah in the book of Bereshit. And we were in the middle of one of the commentaries that was interesting, which had to do with the fact that Adam called Eve the mother of all living. And we realized there was a comment on this here that seemed quite cryptic. That is, Ha'isha im ba'ala ola ve'ina yoredet, that a woman, together with her husband, can go up in status but does not go down with him. Mikra, and what is the origin of this? What is the scriptural basis of this? Amar Rabbi Elazar, said Rabbi Elazar, Ki haita em kol chai, because she was the mother of all living. And l'chaim natna v'lo l'tzar. So he understands the chai not as meaning life in the sense of creatures, but rather life as in things that make life worth living, right? She was given to l'chaim, just as when you say l'chaim and you clink a glass, it means l'chaim tovim, right? For good life, v'lo l'tzar, and not for tribulation. So we are in the middle of doing this, and the Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein had given examples of where the word chai does not have a meaning of life as in terms of living things, but has to do with more with enjoyment and things like that, right? Honor, enjoyment, etc. So, and he mentions that the reason for this, as to not translate it as living things, is because clearly Eve was certainly the mother of all subsequent human beings, but she certainly wasn't the origin of all the animals, etc., etc. So that's why there's a sense and a need to interpret this in a way that's away from how we might be tempted to initially interpret it. And we were in the middle of this, and we hadn't gotten to explain what exactly did we mean by this statement, right? So anyway, v'cho mefarash kan halashon em kochai. And so in this sense, we also explain here this expression of the mother of all chai. Em shleimut hachayim. In other words, either as aim as the mother of the things that fulfill life, that are fulfilling in life. Hasimcha, in other words, joy, right? V'haratzon, and delight, v'nachat ruach, and pleasure, satisfaction. Uvi'ur inyan ze yitachen lefaresh. And again, it's worthwhile explaining exactly what we mean by this. Ki acharei shenit kalala chava me'akadosh baruch hu, that because since Eve had been cursed from God, God had cursed her, right? Lo ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu shetosef litzdaer od al yedei anashim. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not want, right, shetosif, that she should get further aggravation and hurt from people. And since in general, there's a general principle that a woman's husband has a certain jurisdiction over her. Lachen hizhir HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For this reason, the Holy One, blessed be He, warned shetihiyeh rak ola imo, that she should only increase her stature, ve'ena yoredet imo, but she doesn't decrease her stature with him. And he's going to give examples. Klomar, that is to say, shetit shetehene rak mizchuyotav or miyitronotav. That is to say, that she should benefit only from his rights and his privileges and from things, from his successes, in other words, things that he has that are greater things. אבל אינה מחויבת להיזקק לחסרונותיו ufchitotav, but she is not required to have a relation. In other words, to have to suffer from his lacks and from his lowering in status. And we will explain this further. Give me one moment. And there is a practical application, right? We have a practical application of this, the inyan kamadvarim, referring in reference to several different things. Kamo im benot mishpachta enan regilin lahanik ba'atzmam. For example, if the women in her family are not, the custom is for them not to personally suckle et yaldehem, their children, ela sochrot lahem menikot, but rather they hire for them nursing women. Uvanot mishpachto menikot ba'atzmam, but in his family, in the husband's family, the tradition was, or the custom was, for the girls, for the women to suckle themselves. Shum in la, one listens to her. In other words, one has regard for her, ulemin hag mishpachta, and the custom of her family. Mishum de ola imo, and that's exactly because she can only increase her status, ve'ena yoredet imo, but she does not decrease her status. Klomar, that is to say, im haya hadavar lehefech, if in fact it was just the opposite situation, haita hi nehenet mizchut mishpachto. In that case, she would benefit from the fact that his family had this particular tradition and custom. Ava'ata, but now, eina yoredet lefchitut mishpachto, but she does not, in fact, have to lower her status for the fact that his family has a lower status. V'hu hadin le'inyan hamelachot she'isha osa leva'ala, and this is all the more so regarding those labors that a woman does for her husband. Einam mechayevet la'asot ka'ele, she is not obligated to perform those she'ein b'nei mishpachta noagin lasot. If that wasn't the custom in her family, she doesn't adopt the customs of her husband, and of course the opposite. On the other hand, if her husband's family, women did not have these particular obligations, she is not obligated. And he gives you a reference in the codes. Ien be'evan ha'ezer siman pei. He says, look at the part of the Shulchan Aruch called the section called Evan Ha'ezer, which deals with laws of marriage, etc. And basically, we're looking at chapter 80. V'chein le'inyan kvod kvurata, and likewise in terms of the kind of burial that she has and the honor that is given to the husband's family in that family, she has to benefit from it as well. She'im haya kvoda meruba michvodo, and on just the reverse, if in fact in her family they were honored, they spent a lot more money, they made more beautiful monuments, etc. Right? If that was greater than in his family, kovrin ota lefi kvoda, you have to bury her according to the honor that is shown to the deceased in her family. And he says again, Ien be'ever ha'ezer siman peitet. And again, this section of the Shulchan Aruch, Ever ha'ezer, chapter 89. Over Mordechai, and in the Mordechai is a commentary on the Talmud, Perek Yud Gimel de Ketuvot, chapter 13 of the tractate Ketuvot, Katav, he wrote, Dimehai Tama, that for this reason, Im Ishto Eina Yechola Ladur Bebeit Chameha, if his wife is not able to comfortably live in the house of her mother-in-law, mipnei haktata, on account of quarreling, chayav habal, the husband is obligated latetla mezonot beveit aviha. He has to be able to support her in her father's house. V'ien be'shelot utuvot maharit, and he says also in the responsa of the maharit, and the Maharit was a rabbi who lived in Constantinople, considered a major halachist. Let's see, Chelik Gimel, I'm going to suggest, right? Section 3, possibly, Siman Menchet, so this would be chapter 48. This may be actually a different, could be Chidushay something. De'ein bichlal ze le'inyan ketubah, that on the other hand, when it comes to the ketubah, this particular principle does not apply. She'im haya minhag iro meshone miminhag ira, because if in the course of writing a ketubah, his town, his city, had a different custom from the custom of her town, Lo amrinan bazeh ola imo ve'ena yoredet imo. In that case, we do not apply this principle that she is able to rise with him but doesn't go down with him. But tzarich lomar, and one has to say, betam ha'davar, in trying to give a reason for this, de kevan de minhag klalihu, that because this apparently having the writing a kedubah is a general, sounds like a general minhag, which would be a custom, right? Ein bazeh mishum yerida. There is no sense. In other words, I think what it's saying is that writing a ketubah doesn't involve necessarily going up or coming down. It is the general principle of writing a ketubah, mishum yerida. So there is no concept here or application of yeridala v'azlina batre, and so consequently, in this particular case, we follow whatever the custom is in the husband's city. Going on. So we read that afterwards God made for them kotnot, or tunics of the or normally means leather, right, or skins. Rav Ushmuel, and these are two great Amoraim, two great leaders of the Talmudic generation. Chad Amar, one said davar habamina, or one of them said something that comes from skin. V'chad Amar, and one of them said davar sha'or ne'eneh mimenu, and the other one said something from which the skin derives benefit or takes enjoyment, something like that. So, two apparently different explanations, and again, exactly why these particular explanations and what they refer to. Here we go. Ushnehem medaikim, and both of them, in other words, both Rav and Shmuel, are taking note, special note, ki lafi pshuto kasher, that if we take this sentence at its simple meaning, we've got a problem. What is the problem? De lo matzinu b'shum makom, that we don't find anywhere, right? Kotnot shel or mamash, right? That these tunics were made out of animal skin, right? Of real skin. V'gam kafim mevu'ar ba'agadot, and it also mentions in agadot, in supplemental material regarding the creation story and the story of Adam and Eve, the Adam Harishon, that Adam lo achal basar, he was a vegetarian, he did not eat meat, right? And then he says, Iem lamala aleph kaftet. He says, look above at chapter 1, verse 29. V'gam shebe'oto hador, and not only this, we read in these agadot that in that particular generation, lo haya meitim kol habruim, that none of the creatures died. In other words, and I had to puzzle on this, and I think it means that in Adam's generation, meaning that while Adam, because we know that Adam and Eve, in fact, were mortal, it says specifically how long they lived and when they died. They lived a long, 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 long time, but they did die eventually, right? that the creatures that were contemporary with Adam also remained alive all that time. And im kain, and if this is the case, halo lo haya nimtza kol or ba'alam. If that was the case, how could you say there'd be any skin? What leather was there in the world? There was, because they all were alive. The animals were all alive. And for this reason, Rav and Shmuel take the intention of this verse to a different point, to make a different point. So what about the person who says something that comes from the skin? Afal pi kilafi mashikatuv adain kasher, even though it sounds from what we just were saying and what we were just explaining, how does this solve the problem? In fact, there was no leather in the world. There was no skins in the world. Because his intention actually is mimin kazeh shestamo ba min haor. Okay? In other words, it's talking about something that's derived from skin, dahainu tsemer, which in fact is wool. So in other words, that's what he meant, that it was something that came from skin, which was wool. So that he made for them woolen tunics. V'chad amar davar sha'or ne'neman. And the other one was saying that it is something that the skin takes pleasure in or benefits from. V'yitachen shemefaresh halashon kotnot or, okay, kamo kotnot laor. And it appears then that it would appear that he then explains, he interprets the expression kotnot or, right, tunics of skin, as kotnot laor, as tunics for the skin, for their flesh. V'hainu ha'inyan sha'or nehne minam, and that's exactly how we would then say that the skin gets benefit from it, min hakutanot, from those tunics. The Yen Tosafot Nida Cafe, he says, check out in Tosafot, the tractate Nida, page 25a, Shekatvu Vezilit Lanam. This is what they wrote. Quote, De Kotnot or Ba'or Hadam, Ire. That, and by the way, what they say is a little bit difficult to understand too, that when it says tunics of skin, Ba'or Hadam Ire, it's talking about human skin. It's talking about the skin of the person. Kedaminan al Meshach Bisrehon. As the Onkelos translates it, right, on the skin of their flesh. And ad kan lashonam, and that's end of their quote. Velo nitpa'er kavanatam, and so their intention is not clear. It's not so clear as to what they mean by this. But Ian b'mefarshim, he says, and take a look at the ones who explain the Tosafot, ulefi mashikatavnu, but according to what we just wrote, yitpa'er pashut, it becomes quite clear, shemefarshim or kamo laor, that they are in fact explaining that the Tosafot are referring to skin as laor, for the skin. And if we take a quick look at the Onkelos here, it says, levushin, right, clothing, dikar al meshach bisrehon, right, that gives dignity to the skin of their flesh. The al bashinun, and he dressed them, he clothed them. Uva Midrash Rabbah kan, and here in the Midrash Rabbah, referring to this particular verse, Ita, it states, the Torah shel Rabbi Meir, in the Midrash Rabbah, it says that in the version of the Torah of Rabbi Meir, or in Rabbi Meir's Sefer Torah, Matzu Katuv, they found written, Kotnot or Ba'alef. They found tunics of or Ba'alef. So or normally we understand as light. So it sounds like tunics of light, Ba'alef, because as you can see, right, it's or with an ayin, and an ayin has to do with skin, and not an aleph has to do with light, right? The Katfu HaMefarshin, And the commentators wrote the Torah shel Rabbi Meir, that in this Torah of Rabbi Meir, bechidushay Torah shelo, they explained his Torah as meaning his novella regarding the Torah. In other words, his new ideas that he wrote about. Aval leda'ati, but according to in my opinion, ein halashon b'torato mechuvan lefi, right? Leferush zeh, that this expression of his Torah is not so, it doesn't really make sense given this particular explanation of his Torah, right? V'yoter nireh lefaresh, and it makes more sense to explain Shaya midarcho shel Rabbi Meir, that it was Rabbi Meir's practice lasot remazin v'chudashim ktsarim, that he would write allusions or new ideas in brevity, briefly, b'tzidei hagilyon mehasefer, on the side of the column of the sefer, or the parchment of the book, shelimed bo or shelamad bo, in which he was studying. He'd make little notes. Shekain matzinu kama pamim, because we find in several places ha'arot ktsarot b'shem Rabbi Meir b'lashon zeh, that we find a number of times brief explanations in the name of Rabbi Meir in this particular expression. The Torah of Rabbi Meir is what he's saying. We find it introduced that. Kamo b'midrash Rabbah Bereshit, so just as in Midrash Rabbah for Genesis, bisfarim de Rabbi Meir, it says in Rabbi Meir's scrolls, v'hine tov me'od, it says, behold, it was very good. This is another example, Zehamavet. He wrote Zehamavet. This refers to death. In other words, that when God said about the world, this is very good, Rabbi Meir understood it to mean because things don't last forever. Yein sham lefanenu, and you can see above before us. Besfarim de Rabbi Meir katuv, right? And in the scrolls of Rabbi Meir, it is written uven dan hushim, right? Again, there's this particular reference to Rabbi Meir's his books, and it says uven dan instead of bimkom uvenei dan. In our Sefer Torah, it says uvenei dan, right? And the sons of Dan, Hushim, right? Just one son. And in Rabbi Meir's version, he just makes a note. It means his one son. Uvayerushalmu Ta'anit, and in the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Ta'anit, chapter 1, halacha 1, Bisfarim de Rabbi Meir, in Rabbi Meir's clothes, Masa Duma, this is a reference in Isaiah, I think chapter 21, where it talks about the Duma proclamation. He says Masa Romi, that it's actually a reference to a proclamation or a declaration regarding Rome, Vahachi Namichen, and other similar examples. So this Masa Duma, interestingly, I looked it up to find out, and it's because here, as you can see, he doesn't give any reference to the biblical text, and discovered that I found a concordance, and it's in Isaiah, and I looked it up. I actually looked up the reference in the Tanakh, and it has to do with a reference to Esau, interestingly enough. And as I know, according to rabbinic tradition, Esau in the Bible is understood as a reference to Rome. And let's see, I think I'm going to stop here. We have a little bit more to go here, but I will try to think. Should we continue? Well, we have a couple of minutes, so let me go on so we can finish the section. V'hapirush kotnot ol ba'alef lo nipaer. And again, if we're going to explain tunics of or with an aleph as tunics of light, lo nitpaer, that isn't so clear either. What exactly would these tunics of light look like? V'nir'eh lefaresh dehu milashon hapasuk, and it would appear to make sense that we would explain it according to the expression in the verse in chapter 4, verse 39 of the second book of Kings, Vayatza el hasadeh lelaket orot. And there's the or, you see, and in there it means, and he went to the field to gather wild sprouts. It's a story that involves Elisha and feeding the people, and there orot, there's the or, right? So it refers to a plant. And likewise in Isaiah chapter 26, ki tel orot talecha. So it says, because the dew of orot is your dew. And it has to do with how dew is a reference to, according to the commentators, of reincarnation, or yes, so that because they felt that in the summertime dew would bring plants, keep plants alive, or bring plants alive, and that's a reference to some kind of resurrection. Vahu means semach, and here this tal orot is referring to a type of plant. V'hakavana, and the intention was, shetafar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One, blessed be He, sowed for them kotnot me'alei tzmachim. So we now understand that these tunics that the Holy One, blessed be He, was making from them, was made from the leaves of various plants. Vayihiyeh zeh makbil, and this in fact parallels umechuvan leumat, and makes sense, right? In regard to ma shekatuv mikodem, in terms of what was written before, where it says vayet yitparu alei te'ena vayasu lahem chagurot, where it says they sewed the leaves of a fig and made loincloths for themselves. And now, Asalahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, made for them, me'alim, from leaves, means machim shuvnim, from various different kinds of plants, kotnot shleimut, in other words, entire tunics. Before they were just loincloths, but now they had complete tunics. The davar, and going on now, the davar chiluf aleph ba'ayin, and with regards to the interchange of the aleph and ayin, those letters, matzinu pa'amim, we find rabot, we find many times mipnei shehem mimotza achad kenoda. The reason why they're interchanged is because an aleph and an ayin are basically pronounced the same way. They're formed in the mouth in the same way. And here we have examples. Ga'al, right? Where we have this word, these two words, I believe, Ga'al Yisrael, right? Redeemer. That sometimes it's spelled with an ayin, sometimes it's spelled with an aleph. And then we've got, it looks like avon, and possibly avon, if I'm not mistaken, has to do with iniquity. Gemi'ah, this is like taking a mouthful, swallowing a mouthful of something liquid. V'od, and other examples. V'yein Yerushalmi, and check out the Talmud Yerushalmi, Brachot Pechet Halacha Vav, the tractate Brachot, chapter 8, sixth halacha. Uma shedachaku b'chlal l'Rabbi Meir, and the fact that they, in general, had a problem or a difficulty with Rabbi Meir lefaresh hamila or bechiluf or, right? That, how could Rabbi Meir do such a thing? Yitba'er al pi ma shekatuv bereish ha'ot hazeh. In other words, I think what he's saying here is and I think it's shedachko, right? Bichlal the Rabbi Meir. And I think, in other words, why would Rabbi Meir feel a need to do this, right? So that's explained at the beginning of this passage where we were saying, how could you explain it as or meaning skin, when there were no animals that were dead and providing skin at the time, that was the same reason why Rabbi Meir decided to interpret it the way he did. And that is it for today. Thank you for joining me.